This is my true story. I found a baby crying outside a church in the pouring rain 20 years ago, and everyone told me I was crazy for taking him in. I was a widower with barely enough money to feed myself, but I could not leave that child to die in the cold. I raised him alone while people called me foolish and said I was wasting my life on someone else's mistake. But last month, my heart gave out and I was dying on a hospital table when a surgeon rushed in to save me. When I woke up, I saw his face and realized the baby I saved had just saved me back. Before I tell you this story, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe so more people can hear it. I was walking home from my factory shift on a cold November night, and the rain was coming down so hard I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. I had worked a double shift because they were short on people, and I needed the overtime pay to cover my rent. My clothes were soaked through and my boots were filled with water, and all I wanted was to get home and collapse into bed. I was cutting through the old church parking lot to save time when I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a crying sound, but not like an animal or the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby screaming at the top of its lungs. I looked around in the dark, trying to figure out where it was coming from, and then I saw a bundle of cloth on the church steps near the front door. I walked closer, and my heart started pounding when I realized it was a baby wrapped in a blanket that was completely soaked from the rain. The baby was tiny and red-faced and screaming so hard its whole body was shaking. I picked up the bundle and felt how cold the child was, and I knew it had been out there for a while. There was no note and no name and no explanation for why someone would leave a newborn baby on church steps in a rainstorm. I looked around, hoping to see someone nearby who might have just left the baby temporarily, but the parking lot was empty and the street was deserted. I knocked on the church door, but nobody answered because it was almost midnight and the building was locked up for the night. I stood there in the rain holding this screaming baby, and I did not know what to do. Part of me thought I should call the police or take the baby to a hospital or find someone better equipped to handle this situation. But another part of me looked down at that tiny, helpless face and felt something break open in my chest. I had lost my wife 3 years earlier to cancer, and we had never been able to have children of our own. She had always wanted a baby, and we had tried for years, but it never happened. After she died, I lived alone in our small house and went to work and came home, and that was my entire life. I had nothing to offer anyone, and I barely had enough money to take care of myself. My paycheck covered rent and groceries and utilities with almost nothing left over, but standing there in the rain, holding that abandoned baby, I knew I could not just hand him off to the system and walk away. I had been in foster care myself as a kid, and I knew what happened to unwanted children. They got bounced around between homes, and nobody really cared about them, and they grew up feeling like they did not matter to anyone. I did not want that for this baby, even though I had no idea how I would manage to raise a child on my own. I wrapped the baby tighter in the wet blanket and held him against my chest to keep him warm. I walked the rest of the way home as fast as I could, while the baby kept crying and the rain kept falling. When I got to my house, I grabbed every towel I owned and dried the baby off. I had no diapers or formula or baby clothes or anything a newborn needed. I wrapped him in a clean, dry towel and held him close and tried to calm him down. I stayed up all night holding that baby and watching him sleep and wondering what I had just gotten myself into. I knew my life was about to change completely, and I knew people would think I was insane for taking in a random abandoned child. I knew I would struggle financially and probably fail at being a good parent because I had no experience and no help. But when I looked at his tiny face, I felt something I had not felt since my wife died. I felt like my life had purpose again. I decided right then that I would keep him and raise him and give him the family he deserved, even if I had nothing else to give. I took the baby to the hospital the next morning to make sure he was healthy, and the doctors examined him and said he was about 2 days old and surprisingly okay, considering he had been left outside in the rain. They called the police and social services, and I had to explain over and over how I found him on the church steps. The police searched for the mother, but never found anyone, and nobody came forward to claim the baby. Social services told me the child would be placed in foster care while they sorted out the legal issues. I told them I wanted to keep him and apply to be his foster parent, and eventually adopt him, if possible. The social worker looked at me like I had lost my mind. She asked if I was married, and I said no, my wife died 3 years ago. She asked if I had other family who could help, and I said no, I was completely alone. She asked about my income, and I told her I worked at a factory and made barely enough to support myself. She wrote everything down with a skeptical expression and told me it was highly unusual for a single man to foster an infant and that the process would be long and difficult. My neighbors found out what I was doing, and they were not supportive at all. They asked why I would take on someone else's problem when I could barely take care of myself. They said the baby was probably from a drug addict or a prostitute, and that I was asking for trouble by bringing that kind of background into my life. One neighbor told me I was being foolish, and that I would regret it when the child grew up and turned out bad because of his genetics. Another neighbor said it was inappropriate for a single older man to raise a baby, and that people would think I had ulterior motives. The few friends I had slowly stopped calling me after I took the baby in. They thought I had made a crazy, impulsive decision, and they did not want to be around to watch me fail. One friend told me straight to my face that I was throwing my life away and that I should let the professionals handle it. He said I deserved to enjoy my later years in peace instead of starting over with a screaming infant. When I refused to change my mind, he stopped coming around completely. The social workers questioned my motives constantly during the foster care evaluation process. They asked why a single widowed man in his 50s would want to raise a newborn baby. They asked if I understood how much work it would be, and if I was prepared for the financial burden. They did background checks and home inspections and interviewed everyone I knew. Some of their questions felt insulting, like they were trying to find something wrong with me or some hidden agenda I was not admitting to. I told them the truth, which was that I found a baby who needed help, and I could not walk away. I told them I had nothing to offer except a safe home and whatever love I was capable of giving. I told them my wife and I had always wanted children, and this felt like a second chance, even though the circumstances were not what we would have chosen. They wrote everything down, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. The approval process took 6 months, and during that time, I had to attend parenting classes and budgeting workshops and home safety courses. I had to prove I could handle an infant, even though I was learning as I went, just like any first-time parent. The baby stayed in temporary foster care during those months, and I was allowed supervised visits twice a week. Every time I had to leave him, I felt like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. Finally, they approved me as his foster parent, and I brought him home permanently. I named him Daniel because it meant God is my judge, and I figured that was appropriate since everyone else was judging me harshly for this decision. I did not care what anyone thought anymore because I had this little boy who needed me, and that was all that mattered. I started working double shifts at the factory as often as they would let me, because babies are expensive, and I was not prepared for how much everything cost. Diapers and formula and baby clothes added up faster than I could keep track of, and my paycheck barely stretched to cover it all. I would work 16-hour days sometimes and come home exhausted just in time to feed Daniel and change him and rock him back to sleep before I had to wake up and do it all over again. I stopped buying new clothes for myself and wore the same 3 outfits to work until they had holes in them. I only bought new clothes when my old ones literally fell apart because every dollar I saved went towards something Daniel needed. I cut my grocery budget down to almost nothing and ate cheap food like rice and beans and pasta while making sure Daniel had good formula and then later healthy food when he started eating solids. I skipped meals sometimes when money was tight and told myself I was not that hungry anyway. I could not afford daycare on my salary, so I had to get creative with my schedule. I worked night shifts when possible and paid a neighbor $20 to watch Daniel while I was gone. When he got older and started school, I would drop him off in the morning and then sleep for a few hours before going to work in the afternoon. I was constantly exhausted and running on 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night, but I did not have another option if I wanted to keep a roof over our heads. I watched other men my age start to retire or at least cut back their hours and enjoy their grandchildren and take vacations. I watched them buy new cars and fix up their houses and go out to eat at restaurants on weekends. I could not do any of that because every extra dollar went toward raising Daniel. I drove the same beat-up truck for 15 years and only fixed it when something broke that made it undrivable. I never went on vacation, and I never ate at restaurants, and I never bought anything for myself that was not absolutely necessary. When Daniel needed school supplies, I made sure he had everything on the list, even if it meant I had to skip paying a bill that month. When he wanted to play Little League, I signed him up and paid the fees, even though it meant I had to pick up extra shifts to afford it. When he needed a winter coat, because he had outgrown his old one, I bought him a good one that would last, and I wore my threadbare coat for another year. Other kids had new toys and video games and name-brand clothes, but Daniel did not. I felt guilty about that sometimes and worried he would resent me for not being able to give him the things his classmates had. But I made sure he had what he needed, even if he did not have what he wanted. He had clean clothes, even if they came from thrift stores. He had full meals, even if they were simple. He had a warm, safe home, even if it was small and old. I never told him how much I was struggling or how many sacrifices I was making because I did not want him to feel like a burden. I wanted him to feel loved and secure, and I did not want him carrying guilt about the cost of raising him. When he asked why we did not have things other families had, I told him we had everything that mattered. I told him possessions did not make a person valuable, and that character was more important than money. I kept grinding and kept pushing and kept choosing Daniel over my own comfort every single day. My body started breaking down from the years of hard labor and long hours. My back hurt constantly, and my knees ached, and I developed high blood pressure from stress and poor diet. But I kept working because stopping was not an option. Daniel needed me, and I was not going to let him down, no matter what it cost me physically or financially. Daniel never knew luxury or wealth or what it felt like to have everything he wanted, but he knew what it felt like to be loved completely. He grew up in a small house with secondhand furniture and clothes from thrift stores, but he never went to bed wondering if he mattered or if someone cared about him. I made sure he knew every single day that he was wanted and valued, and that I chose him on purpose. I told him the story of how I found him in the rain and decided to keep him because walking away was not something I could live with. He asked me once, when he was about 8 years old, why I took him in when I had nothing to give him. I told him that love does not require money, and that the most important things a parent can give a child are time and attention and the feeling of being safe. I told him I might not be able to buy him expensive things, but I would always show up for him and always fight for him and always make sure he knew he belonged to someone. He hugged me so tightly that day and said he did not need anything except me. I taught him everything I knew about being a good man, even though I was not sure I was qualified to teach anyone anything. I taught him that hard work was not something to be ashamed of, and that there was dignity in earning your own way through life. I taught him to be honest, even when lying would be easier, and to keep his word even when breaking it would be more convenient. I taught him that how you treat people when they can do nothing for you shows your real character. We were poor in possessions, but we were rich in respect for each other. We ate dinner together every night at our small kitchen table and talked about our days. I helped him with his homework, even when I did not understand the material, and we figured it out together. We played catch in the backyard with a ball that was falling apart, and we watched movies on our old television that only got 3 channels. We did not need much because we had each other, and that was enough. Daniel saw how hard I worked, and he started working hard too. He took school seriously because he said he did not want my sacrifices to be wasted. He got good grades without me having to push him, and he stayed out of trouble because he said he did not want to disappoint me. When other kids were getting into drugs or gangs or dropping out, he stayed focused because he understood that his life could have been very different if I had not picked him up off those church steps. He called me Dad, even though I never legally adopted him because the process was too expensive and complicated. The word made my heart swell every time he said it because I had never expected to be anyone's father. He told people I was his dad, and he never mentioned that we were not related by blood. To him, it did not matter how we became family, it only mattered that we were family. We were 2 souls bound together not by biology, but by choice and sacrifice and unwavering commitment to each other. I chose him when he was a helpless newborn, with no name and no future. He chose me back every day by being the kind of son that made every sacrifice worth it. We built our bond through years of struggling together and supporting each other and refusing to give up when things got hard. When he was a teenager and other kids were rebelling against their parents, he stayed close to me. He helped around the house without being asked, and he got a part-time job to help pay for his own expenses so I would not have to work so much. He told me he wanted to make my life easier because I had spent his whole childhood making his life possible. I told him he did not owe me anything, but he said it was not about owing, it was about loving. I watched him grow from that tiny crying baby into a young man with integrity and compassion and strength. I was proud of him in ways I could not put into words. Everything I had given up and everything I had sacrificed felt insignificant compared to the gift of watching him become who he was. On Daniel's 18th birthday, we sat at our kitchen table eating the cake I had bought from the grocery store bakery, and he looked at me with serious eyes. He had just graduated high school with honors and had gotten acceptance letters from several colleges. I was proud of him, but I was also terrified because I had no idea how we would pay for college. I had saved a little bit over the years, but it was nowhere near enough to cover tuition and books and housing. I told him he should apply for every scholarship he could find and that we would figure it out somehow. He put down his fork and reached across the table and grabbed my hand. He said, "Dad, you saved my life when I had nothing and nobody wanted me." He said, "You worked yourself into the ground to give me a childhood, and you never complained once about how hard it was." He said, "You wore the same clothes for years and skipped meals and never bought yourself anything so I could have what I needed." His voice was shaking, and I could see tears in his eyes. He told me he was going to medical school, and he was going to become a doctor. I started to interrupt and tell him that medical school was too expensive and that we needed to be realistic about what we could afford. But he held up his hand and told me to let him finish. He said he had already applied for scholarships and financial aid, and he had gotten a full ride to a state university for his undergraduate degree. He said he would work part-time during school and full-time during summers to save money for medical school. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret picking me up off those church steps." He said he was going to become successful enough to take care of both of us and that I would never have to work another double shift or skip another meal. He said he was going to pay back every sacrifice I made, even though I never asked him to. He said it was not about obligation, it was about love and gratitude and wanting to honor everything I had done for him. I tried to tell him he did not owe me anything and that raising him had been my choice and my privilege. I told him I did not save him, so he would feel indebted to me for the rest of his life. But he shook his head and said this was not about debt, it was about making sure the man who gave him a life got to enjoy his own life before it was too late. He said he had watched me sacrifice for 18 years, and now it was his turn to sacrifice for me. He kept his promise and worked harder than any person I had ever seen. He graduated college in 3 years instead of 4 by taking extra classes and summer courses. He worked nights as a security guard and weekends as a tutor to save every dollar he could. He applied for every scholarship and grant available, and he got into medical school with financial aid that covered most of his tuition. He lived in the cheapest apartment he could find and ate ramen noodles and rice, just like I had done when he was young. He called me every week from medical school and told me about his classes and his rotations and how exhausted he was. I heard the tiredness in his voice, and I knew he was pushing himself too hard. I told him to slow down and take care of himself, but he said he could not slow down because he had made a promise. He said every time he wanted to quit or give up, he thought about me working double shifts at the factory, and that gave him the strength to keep going. He said the promise he made on his 18th birthday was not just words, it was a vow that burned inside him like fuel. He said gratitude was the most powerful motivator he had ever known, and that he would not rest until I was taken care of the way I had taken care of him. I was 73 years old and still working at the factory because I could not afford to retire. My body was falling apart from decades of hard labor and long hours. My back was so bad I could barely stand up straight anymore, and my knees made cracking sounds every time I walked. I had high blood pressure and high cholesterol, and the doctor kept telling me I needed to slow down before something serious happened. But I could not afford to slow down because my savings were almost gone, and my Social Security check barely covered my rent and utilities. Daniel had finished medical school and was doing his residency at a hospital 3 hours away. He sent me money every month even though I told him not to because he was drowning in student loan debt. He called me twice a week and begged me to retire and said he would support me, but I refused because I did not want to be a burden after he had worked so hard to build his career. I told him I was fine and that I could work a few more years until he was more stable financially. But I was not fine. I was exhausted all the time and my chest had been hurting for weeks. I thought it was just stress or maybe heartburn from eating cheap processed food. I did not go to the doctor because I could not afford the bills, and I did not want Daniel to worry about me. I just kept showing up to work and pushing through the pain because that was what I had always done. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in my apartment. I had just gotten home from my shift, and I was making a sandwich in the kitchen when I felt a crushing pain in my chest that took my breath away. I grabbed the counter to steady myself, but my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the kitchen floor. The pain was so intense I could not scream or call for help. I tried to reach for my phone on the counter, but my arm would not move the way I wanted it to. I lay there on the cold linoleum floor, staring at the ceiling and feeling my heart beat irregularly in my chest. I could feel myself fading, and I knew something was seriously wrong. I thought about Daniel and how he would feel when he found out I died alone on my kitchen floor. I thought about how I would never get to see him succeed, or watch him get married, or meet his children. I felt sad that I would not be there to see the man he would become. I do not know how long I was on that floor before my neighbor heard a thud and came to check on me. She had a key to my apartment because I was old, and she worried about me living alone. She found me unconscious and barely breathing, and she called 911 immediately. The paramedics arrived and loaded me onto a stretcher and rushed me to the hospital with sirens blaring. I woke up briefly in the ambulance and heard the paramedics saying my vitals were crashing and that I was in cardiac arrest. One of them was doing chest compressions and the other was putting needles in my arm. Everything was blurry and I could not focus on anything. I heard someone say we are losing him and then everything went black again. They got me to the emergency room and hooked me up to machines that beeped and monitored my failing heart. A doctor examined me and told the nurses my heart was severely damaged and that I needed emergency surgery immediately, or I would not make it through the night. They were prepping me for surgery when someone asked if I had any family they should call. A nurse found Daniel's number in my phone and called him at the hospital where he was working. She told him his father had suffered a massive heart attack and was in critical condition and probably would not survive. She said he should come quickly if he wanted to say goodbye. I did not know any of this was happening because I was unconscious and fighting for my life on a table while doctors tried to stabilize me enough for surgery. Daniel was in the middle of his shift when he got the call from the nurse telling him I was dying. He was 3 hours away at a different hospital and he had no car because he took the bus everywhere to save money. He ran out of the hospital still wearing his scrubs and stopped the first person he saw in the parking lot. He begged them to let him borrow their car and promised he would bring it back. The person must have seen the desperation on his face because they handed him the keys without asking questions. He drove like a maniac, breaking every speed limit and running red lights when it was safe. He called ahead to the hospital where I was and told them he was a cardiac surgery resident and that the patient they were working on was his father. He said he was coming to assist with the surgery and that they needed to wait for him if possible. The staff told him there was no time to wait and that they had to operate immediately or I would die before he arrived. He made the 3-hour drive in just under 2 hours and pulled into the hospital parking lot with the tires screeching. He left the borrowed car running in the emergency lane and sprinted through the front doors, still wearing his scrubs from the other hospital. He ran through the hallways, pushing past people and yelling for someone to tell him where his father was. A nurse pointed him toward the operating room and told him they had just started surgery 5 minutes ago. He burst through the OR doors and the surgical team looked up in shock. The lead surgeon was an older man who had already opened my chest and was looking at my damaged heart. Daniel identified himself as a cardiac surgery resident and said he was the patient's son. He asked if he could scrub in and assist, and the lead surgeon looked at him like he was crazy. The surgeon said, "You cannot operate on your own father, it is against protocol, and you are too emotionally involved." Daniel stood there shaking and said with all due respect, "Sir, that is my father on the table, and he is the only family I have in the world." He said, "I am a trained surgeon, and my hands are steady, and I need to be in this room when you try to save his life. He said if I cannot assist, then let me observe, but please do not make me wait outside while you decide whether he lives or dies. Something in his voice must have convinced the surgeon, because after a long pause, he nodded and told Daniel to scrub in. Daniel washed his hands and arms with shaking fingers and put on a sterile gown and gloves. He walked to the operating table and looked down at my open chest and saw my heart struggling to beat. The lead surgeon explained that my main coronary artery was almost completely blocked and that massive damage had already occurred. He said they needed to do an emergency bypass and repair the damaged tissue, but that my chances of survival were less than 30% given my age and the extent of the damage. Daniel asked if he could take the lead on the surgery, and the older surgeon looked at him with surprise. He said, "You are a resident, not an attending, and this is your father, which makes you the worst possible choice to be the primary surgeon." But Daniel said, "I have done this procedure 50 times in the past year, and my success rate is higher than anyone else in my program." He said his hands would not shake, and his judgment would not falter because failing was not an option. He said, "The person on this table saved my life 20 years ago, and I will not let him die now." The lead surgeon stared at him for a long moment and then stepped back from the table. He said, "All right, Dr. Matthews, show me what you can do, but I will be watching every move you make, and if I see any hesitation or any mistakes, I will take over immediately." Daniel nodded and positioned himself over my open chest and picked up the surgical instruments. He took a deep breath and began the most important surgery of his life. Daniel operated on me for 8 brutal hours straight without taking a single break. His hands moved with precision and confidence as he bypassed the blocked artery and repaired the damaged tissue in my heart. The lead surgeon watched him closely for the first hour, ready to take over at any sign of weakness. But Daniel never wavered. His cuts were clean, and his stitches were perfect, and his decisions were sound, even though he was operating on the person he loved most in the world. The surgical team watched in amazement as this young resident performed surgery with a level of skill that exceeded his training and experience. One of the nurses told me later that she had never seen anyone operate with such focus and determination. She said Daniel barely blinked, and he did not speak except to give clear, concise instructions to his team. She said it was like watching someone fight death itself and refuse to accept defeat. Halfway through the surgery, my heart stopped beating completely, and the monitors started screaming with alarm. The lead surgeon stepped forward ready to take over, but Daniel stayed calm and began manual compressions while simultaneously continuing the bypass procedure. He shocked my heart twice with the defibrillator and kept working even when everyone else in the room thought it was over. After 2 terrifying minutes, my heart started beating again, weak and irregular, but alive. Daniel did not celebrate or even pause. He just kept operating with the same steady hands and the same fierce concentration. He repaired every damaged vessel and checked every connection twice and made sure everything was perfect before he would move on to the next step. The lead surgeon told him he was doing excellent work and that he should be proud, but Daniel did not respond. He was too focused on keeping me alive to acknowledge any praise. The surgery stretched into the 6th hour and then the 7th, and Daniel's scrubs were soaked through with sweat. One of the nurses asked if he needed a break or if someone else should take over, but he shook his head and said he would finish what he started. His legs were shaking from standing in one position for so long, and his back was aching, but he refused to stop. He said later that he kept thinking about all the double shifts I worked at the factory and all the times I pushed through exhaustion for him, and that gave him the strength to keep going. By the 8th hour, he was finally closing my chest and making sure every suture was secure. The lead surgeon checked his work thoroughly and found nothing to criticize. He told Daniel he had just performed one of the most difficult cardiac surgeries he had ever witnessed, and that he had done it flawlessly under the worst possible circumstances. He said most surgeons would have fallen apart operating on a family member, but Daniel had somehow separated his emotions from his skills and done what needed to be done. When the last stitch was in place and my heart was beating steadily on the monitors, Daniel finally stepped back from the table. He pulled off his mask, and his face was pale and his eyes were red. He looked down at me lying there unconscious with tubes and wires coming out of my body, and he started to shake. The adrenaline that had kept him going for 8 hours suddenly drained out of him, and his legs almost gave out. He stumbled backward and collapsed against the wall of the operating room. His whole body was trembling, and he could not catch his breath. The mask he had been wearing for 8 hours was soaked with sweat and tears he had not allowed himself to shed while he was operating. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor with his head in his hands, and finally let himself fall apart now that the surgery was over and I was still alive. The lead surgeon put his hand on Daniel's shoulder and told him he had just saved his father's life against impossible odds. He said very few people could have done what Daniel just did, and that he should be incredibly proud. Daniel just nodded, but he could not speak because he was crying too hard. He had given everything he had to keep me alive, and now that it was done, he had nothing left. I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit with tubes in my throat and wires attached to my chest. Everything hurt, and I could not remember what had happened or where I was. The lights were too bright, and the sounds of the machines were too loud, and I felt panic rising in my chest. A nurse saw me wake up and rushed over to calm me down. She told me I had suffered a massive heart attack and that I had undergone emergency surgery. She said I was very lucky to be alive. I tried to speak, but the breathing tube in my throat made it impossible. The nurse told me not to try to talk and that the doctor would remove the tube soon. She adjusted my pillows and checked my monitors, and then she told me something that made my heart skip. She said my son had performed the surgery himself and that he had been sitting beside my bed for 3 days straight, refusing to leave. She pointed to the corner of the room, and I turned my head slowly to see Daniel asleep in a chair beside me. He was still wearing his scrubs, and they were wrinkled and stained. His hair was messy, and his face was covered with stubble, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he had not slept in days. His head was tilted back against the wall, and his mouth was slightly open, and he looked completely exhausted. I wanted to reach out and touch him, but my arms were too heavy, and I could barely move. The nurse whispered that Daniel had refused to go home, or change clothes, or eat properly since the surgery. She said he checked my monitors every few minutes and consulted with the other doctors constantly and slept in that chair because he would not leave my side. She said the hospital staff had tried to make him go home and rest, but he told them he was not leaving until he knew I was going to be okay. She said he had saved my life in the operating room, and now he was determined to make sure I stayed alive. I stared at him sleeping in that chair, and I felt tears running down my face. I thought about the tiny baby I had found crying on church steps 20 years ago. I thought about the little boy who used to hold my hand and call me Dad. I thought about the teenager who promised he would make all my sacrifices worth it. And now here he was, a skilled surgeon who had literally held my heart in his hands and refused to let it stop beating. A doctor came in an hour later and removed the breathing tube from my throat. I coughed and gasped for air, and the sound woke Daniel up immediately. He jumped out of the chair and rushed to my bedside with panic in his eyes. He grabbed my hand and asked if I was okay and if I was in pain. His voice was hoarse and shaky, and I could see how scared he had been. I squeezed his hand weakly and tried to smile, even though my face felt stiff. The doctor told me that I had been on that operating table for 8 hours and that no other surgeon thought I would survive. He said my heart had been too damaged and my age was working against me, and the odds of making it through the surgery were almost zero. But Daniel had performed what he called a miracle. He said he had never seen a resident operate with that level of skill and determination. He said Daniel had repaired my heart when everyone else thought it was impossible. Daniel was crying and holding my hand and telling me he was sorry he was not there when I collapsed. He said if he had been checking on me more often, he would have noticed I was sick, and he could have prevented the heart attack. I shook my head and used all my strength to tell him it was not his fault. I told him he saved my life and that I owed him everything. He cried harder and said I had it backwards and that he was the one who owed me everything. The nurse who had been there during the surgery came in and heard us talking. She smiled and told me the truth about what happened in that operating room. Daniel took 6 months off from his residency program to take care of me while I recovered. He moved me out of my tiny apartment and into a house he bought that had 2 bedrooms so I could live with him. He hired a nurse to help me during the day while he was at work, and he took care of me himself every evening and every weekend. He cooked my meals and helped me with physical therapy and drove me to every doctor's appointment. He treated me the way I had treated him when he was helpless and needed someone to care for him. I tried to tell him he did not need to do all of this and that I could manage on my own, but he refused to listen. He said I had spent 20 years sacrificing for him, and now it was his turn to sacrifice for me. He said he would not let me live alone anymore and struggle to pay bills and work myself to death. He said those days were over and that I was going to spend the rest of my life being taken care of properly. He paid off all my debts and closed my factory retirement account that had barely anything in it. He set up a bank account in my name and deposited money every month so I would never have to worry about expenses again. He bought me new clothes and a new phone and a comfortable recliner for the living room. He made sure I had everything I needed and most of the things I wanted. He gave me the comfort and security I had been denied my entire life because I had spent everything on raising him. On quiet evenings, we would sit together in the living room and watch television or just talk about our days. Sometimes we would sit in comfortable silence the same way we did when he was young and we were too tired or too poor to do anything else. Those moments felt sacred because we both understood how close we had come to losing each other. I had almost died on that operating table, and he had almost lost the only father he had ever known. One evening, he looked at me with serious eyes and said, "Dad, do you remember the promise I made on my 18th birthday?" I nodded, and he continued. He said, "You found me crying in the rain with nothing and no future, and you gave me everything you had." He said, "You worked yourself into the ground and sacrificed your health and your comfort so I could have a life worth living." He said, "You saved me when I was helpless and had nobody." Then he said, "I found you dying with everything because you gave it all to me." He said he had watched me collapse under the weight of decades of sacrifice, and he had held my broken heart in his hands in that operating room. He said he had felt my life slipping away, and he had fought like hell to pull me back. He said saving my life was not a debt being repaid, it was love being returned in the only way he knew how. I told him he had given me more than I ever gave him. I told him I picked up a baby in the rain, but he had grown into a man who saved my life and gave me a home and made sure my final years would be filled with peace instead of struggle. I told him some people spend their whole lives looking for proof that their sacrifices mattered, and I got to see that proof every single day when I looked at him. He smiled and said we saved each other. He said I saved him from dying as a nameless abandoned baby, and he saved me from dying as a lonely old man who worked himself to death. He said we were even now and that the rest of our lives would be about living together instead of just surviving separately. He said family was not about blood. It was about who showed up when you needed them most. 20 years ago, I found a crying baby in the rain, and everyone said I was crazy for keeping him. Last year, that baby saved my life on an operating table when nobody else thought I would survive. Some debts are paid in heartbeats, and some bonds are built in sacrifice. I am alive because I chose love over logic, and he is the man he is because I never gave up on him. We came full circle and found each other twice. Once in the rain and once in an operating room, and both times it was love that made us family.